What's up, guys? We got a couple of new unique augments yesterday, the most relevant of which being Yukikaze and Monarch. Both of them being ships that were really good back in 1865 or so, but haven't really seen the light of day in a little over a century. I'm going to start with Yukikaze since her upgrades are pretty simple. She got a brand new, very powerful, fully torpedo scaling barrage, but it is tied to her torpedo launch, so it's not going to be as spammable as the main gun barrages on ships like Z-52 and Kawakaze. Here's what the barrage looks like in game, and I put an equipment skin over her actual torpedo so you can tell the difference between the barrage and the torpedoes themselves. While the first part of it just looks like normal shelling, apparently it actually scales off of torpedo, and I would probably trust this database over what I'm seeing here with my very own eyes because I'm pretty sure that this is ripped straight from the game files. So it could very well be a mistake on the developer's part because these bullets don't have the same properties as typical torpedo scaling barrages, such as ignoring shields, but I'll take what I can get. You can try using faster torpedoes to get more barrages off, but faster torpedoes aren't really that much faster than the default recommendation of quad mags, so even if you do use faster torpedoes, you'll get at most one extra barrage off in a fight, which is not something worth fixating on. Her barrage also isn't targeted or homing, so not something you should count on for single target damage. She also got a small last stand skill, but it requires her to reach 1 HP, so it's definitely going to be much more useful in PvP than PvE, as reaching 1 HP in PvE will more likely than not be the end of her even with the skill. I would say that the closest comparison with her would be Hatsuzuki. They're both relatively bulky destroyers with decent damage output and damage reduction for other members of the fleet. Yukikaze wins in terms of main fleet protection and is slightly tankier herself, while Hatsuzuki provides a little bit more protection for your other Vanguard ships. But overall, I would probably choose Yukikaze more often than not between the two, because main fleet protection is more valuable and Yukikaze herself being tankier indirectly helps your other two Vanguards anyway, so she'll sneak into B tier as one of the better destroyers. Now, let's take a look at Monarch's unique augment. Just making her barrage guaranteed is already solid, but she also got a sizable firepower and accuracy buff, not only the percentage buff, but on the stats of the augment itself as well. Her barrage also had its slow and armor modifiers increased, as well as an evasion stat debuff slapped onto it. Note that it's evasion stat and not evasion rate, so the actual effect is quite small. On first impression, she's definitely in the upper half of A tier as she's just better than Izumo once again. She has a couple of weaknesses, being her damage against light armor and her barrage being fixed, so enemies that are too close or too far won't be consistently hit as hard as the enemies around the middle of the field, unlike the aimed barrages of Dyson or Tamaki for example. Then, the fact that she always has to hog the flagship position because of her barrage is also kind of annoying these days, with how you have to consider making her fire first to apply her slow as well as potentially trigger Trafalgar's debuff, and you also want your strongest damaging battleship in the flagship position for the juicy Plymouth buff, and then her reload is also lower than that of most of the best battleships in the game, assuming she doesn't take a bit of damage. Still, that is relatively minor. At most, you might have to make do with an autoloader or something. Fighting a boss that will consistently deal some damage to her will definitely help with the reload part at least. I think for now, I'll actually stick her in the top of A tier, likely having better campaign performance than Izumo, and then being able to match or potentially exceed Dyson's performance in single target battles if her consistent slow comes into play, which should be the primary reason to bring her anyway. I took her out for a spin in chapter 15.3 with a few other ships that I haven't really showcased, but before that, I also wanted to talk about some minor changes I made to the carrier tier list. Since I already had an S** tier for Vanguards and an S- tier for battleships, I figured I could just do the same for carriers, since I already did say there was a notable gap between the UR carriers in front and behind Independence. Although I will say, the gap is exacerbated by having to fight for slots against not only each other, but battleships as well. For example, while Haku hasn't really been able to find herself a slot in many of the best fleets since Amagi's release, Haku isn't actually that much weaker than Amagi, but there's just no room for Haku when you consider all the other options like Shinano, Nakimov, Lion, Soyuz, Mecklenburg, etc. etc. Overall, I would say that the gap between the S tier carriers and the S- tier carriers is a little bit smaller than the gap between the S tier battleships and the S- tier battleships. I dropped SX to S- tier as well because, when I thought about it, I have, and I still do, after all, value being the best at one thing over being the second or third best at a few things, which is what SX is. Another reason is because I took the SX fleet I was using against Kawakaze meta, replaced Yorktown with Fritz Rume, and it didn't work as well, and then I replaced SX with Rume instead, and it worked about just as well. So even with Yorktown's cooldown reduction and damage buffs, Fritz Rume still outputs as much if not more thanks to her universal debuff. So yeah, SX is just a victim of being a jack of all trades, but until your account is stacked enough to be min-maxing every little thing, SX's retrofit is still one of the best investments that will be a huge upgrade for any content. Speaking of Fritz Rume, it's actually kind of crazy how hard she was underestimated on release. I personally rated her one spot below Nakimov at the lowest, which is still the case, but now Nakimov is the top dog. But to be honest, she's making a good case for being number one, just due to how she can be sortied with any two other ships of your choice, while Nakimov essentially locks you to running at least Soyuz. After a couple more UR releases, it could be the case that it'll be hard to justify running both Soyuz and Nakimov, in which case I might consider moving Fritz Rume to first place. Okay, now, here is the 15.3 showcase I promised. Pause if you want to see the ship's equipment. Provincian is being used as the anti-air carry, Trafalgar for more anti-air as well as anti-submarine duty, and she also buffs the HMS ships in the fleet as a small bonus, and then Bayard with her recent face simulation to see if she can tank the chapter, and then Monarch with Unicorn and Aquila, pretty standard main fleet setup. I'm using a Spearfish on Unicorn so that her cooldown would be a little bit further away from Aquila's, in order to desync their airstrikes. I'm using no officers, but all my fleet tech is on, so for a normal player, having a couple of maxed out cats and about half the fleet tech should be approximately the same. My 15.3 is on 8% damage reduction, which is not as difficult as full lethal, but much more difficult than clearing mode with 20% reduction. I'm not going to show the boss fleet equipment because I didn't even do the boss, since I don't want to decrease the threat level of the stage any further. Some general tips for clearing Chapter 15 for those who haven't heard it before from any of my videos. Battleship nodes are much more difficult than the others, because it's very, very difficult to consistently prevent the enemy battlecruisers from setting your main fleet ships on fire, and those burns hurt. If you don't believe me, put your hand in the fire and see how it feels. Anyway, if you want to attempt them, make sure to do so while you still have ammo and your fleet starts healthy. Additionally, try to pay attention to which type of nodes your fleet has the easiest time with, and save those for later fights when you don't have ammo. This should be the regular carrier nodes if you have sufficient anti-air, but escort nodes if your anti-air is barely passable. But when you're out of ammo, your anti-submarine damage is also halved, while your anti-air damage is not, so keep that in mind. Okay, that's all from me for this one. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.
がいい。この艦隊を一隻たりともかけることなく連れ帰ってみせる。救いはここにある。この一瞬を海の記憶に刻んで、この幻想なる帝王を従えられない。救いはここにある。終わりが大切なもの終わりましたよ。救いはここにある。もう終わりましたよ。この一瞬を海の記憶に刻んで、この幻想なる帝王を従えられない。頑張る。挨拶はもう終わりましたよ。救いはここにある。挨拶はもう終わりましたよ。挨拶はもう終わりましたよ。この一瞬を海の記憶に刻んで、この幻想なる救いはここにある。ユニコーン頑張る。救いはここにある。女王の号令でもこの幻想なる帝王を従えられない。海の記憶に刻んで終わりましたよ。サポート役でも妹指揮官に代わりトーマス頑張る。救いはここにある。この一瞬を海の記憶に刻んで、この幻想なる帝王を従えられない。ユニコーン救いはここにある。ここにある。愛せこの一瞬終わりました。海の記憶に刻んで、この幻想なる帝王を従えられない。救いはここにある。頑張る。救いはここにある。終わりますよ。挨拶はもう終わりましたよ。この一瞬を海の記憶に刻んで、この幻想なる帝王を従えられない。こんにちは。サポート役でも妹行き。指揮官に代わりトーマス頑張る。救いはここにある。戦い早く終わりますように。この一瞬を海の記憶に刻んで、この幻想なる帝王を従えられない。ユニコーン頑張る。ここにある。終わりましたね。ここにある。この一瞬を海の記憶に刻んで、この幻想なる帝王を従えられない。ユニコーン頑張る。救いはここにある。終わりますように。挨拶はもう終わりましたよ。この一瞬を海の記憶に刻んで、この幻想なる帝王を従えられない。あんたが指揮だ。さあ頼るがいい。私がずっと勝ち続け。頼るがいい。この艦隊を一隻たりともかけることなく連れ帰ってみせる。救いはここにある。早く終わりますように。この一瞬を海の記憶に刻んで、この幻想なる帝王を従えられない。救いはここにある。終わります。挨拶はもう終わりましたよ。救いはここにある。この一瞬を海の記憶に刻んで、この幻想なる帝王を従
さあ頼るがいい。私がずっと勝ち続けてみせる。